Hello. Thank you for joining us here today for this discussion on our first lab director, J. Robert Oppenheimer. I'm Bri Steeves, director of the National Security Research Center. Our organization actually began as Oppenheimer's technical library back in 1943, so World War II. Today, 80 years later, we are the lab's classified library, and we also curate unclassified materials of historic value. Oppenheimer's story is entwined with our story, and that's what we're here to talk about today. It's an honor to welcome these four panelists and the moderator to be with us. Thank you. As an important side note, the NSRC is creating a documentary on Oppenheimer, and our four panelists and our moderator are all featured in that documentary. It's due out later this summer. I've also heard that there's another Oppenheimer film coming out this summer at about the same time. So apparently that film has Matt Damon in it. Our documentary, though, has photos and film from our historic collections. So I do think visually we're probably giving Christopher Nolan a run for his money. So I do hope you'll watch both. And with that, I will turn it over to Alan Carr, the NSRC's senior historian, to moderate today's discussion. Thank you.
Well, Bri, thank you very, very much. This day has been many months in the making, and I've been looking forward to it for a very long time, and I think that you're going to really enjoy the rest of the afternoon today with our panelists. Let me briefly introduce them for you, and then they're going to tell you a little bit about themselves in just a moment, a little bit more. My friend Anna Lobet down there is, of course, one of our scientists here at the laboratory, and I hope that everybody's familiar with her very important work. She just wrapped up another successful summer physics camp for girls. So if you want to make a difference in our community, in our region, and beyond, talk with Anna, and she can help you do that, guaranteed. Of course, Tom Mason is the director of the laboratory. Kai Bird, the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of J. Robert Oppenheimer, our first director, and Tim Reeser. So Tim worked in the Senate as Senator Leahy's advisor on foreign policy for 37 years. And I think that between the four of our panelists today, you are going to have an incredible perspective on various aspects of J. Robert Oppenheimer's life. Now, I think maybe the best place to start today is, with today. The laboratory's, 17,000 people strong now. It's an incredible place where, just like during the Manhattan Project, people from all over the world come here to make important contributions to national and international security. And that's pretty exciting. I've been honored to be here for 20 years now and to watch history continue to unfold. Of course, we think about J. Robert Oppenheimer. He is our legendary first director. He always will be. They're still making movies about him today. He lived an incredible life, a life that was not always very easy. He faced a lot of adversity during his life. Some of it was of his own making, but he was able to overcome it and do something truly remarkable. And we're going to be talking about that this afternoon. And so I hope that today this will be interesting and entertaining. I hope that it'll be inspiring, the discussion. Now, all of you get to participate. And I want to remind you of that. We're going to encourage all of you to participate. We're probably going to carry the conversation for you until about 4. And then you have all this time to get all of those questions ready to go for our panelists today. So don't hold back. You'll be hearing from them shortly. In fact, I'm going to turn it over to them right now. I'm going to let Tom has a few words, and so does everyone else on our panel. So please, Tom.
Well, thanks for being here. I'm looking forward to this discussion. It's kind of a topic that obviously I'm quite interested in myself, in the sense that it's you can't come into the job I'm in without thinking about Oppenheimer. And one of the things that I've noticed over the years, I really became aware, I think, when I was involved in the Spallation Neutron Source project. It was a project that involved 6 DOE labs. And what I discovered is that each lab has its own personality. You could interact with the staff from the different labs. Los Alamos was one of them, but we had, Berkeley and Argonne, and Brookhaven, Jefferson Lab, and Oak Ridge as well. And the way they did their work, how they interacted with each other and between the labs, was actually different. And it was different in a way that, I've been in the national labs for almost, 35 years or so. It was different in a way that was durable over time. It wasn't dependent on the particular individual you were interacting with. It was something about the character of the labs. And I'm sure many of you who've worked with colleagues at the other labs have seen this. There's a way that they go about doing things that's embedded in the character of the lab. And that lasts over time that is longer than the duration of any single career. Because people come into these institutions and they learn how to do work at Los Alamos. And that's something that they pick up from their colleagues. And I think that character of the lab comes from a couple of different things. Certainly, part of it is location. Our location is pretty special and very different than, say, Long Island or Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And that has an impact on the character of the lab. But I think certainly for Los Alamos, a big part of the personality of this lab, you can actually trace back to Oppenheimer and the view he took to how to solve this problem of taking what was only very recently new discoveries. Remember, the neutron was discovered in 1932 by James Chadwick. So basically, 10 years prior to the Chicago pile was the first observation of its existence. So how do you turn that into something that can impact a conflict where thousands and thousands, millions of people are dying? So there's very strong sense of urgency. And I think the approach that Oppenheimer took, and you see it embedded in quotes outside the elevator as you go up this building in terms of the importance of really applying the best scientific principles to solving these problems, free and open debate, which, oh, by the way, is one reason we're in the location we're in, the very special location. It all goes back to him. And it's remarkable how 80 years later, this year, of course, is the 80th anniversary of the lab, we have some of that same character that was established in the 2.5 years between 1943 and 1945. It's a remarkable thing, and I think it sort of speaks to the impact of his contribution. So I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Tom, very much. Anna, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm an experimental physicist. I was born and raised in Barcelona, in Spain. And as I came to Los Alamos as a postdoc 22 years ago, I was struck by the broad range of science that was done up here. And as time went by, I got to learn more about Oppenheimer to the point that he became, with Hamilton, one of my heroes. Not only his persona, his intellect, he was a strong humanist and a lover of the arts, but his leadership, his ability to inspire others to better the world. And when I'm asked outside of this environment, why do I work where I work, I always say that I want to make the world a better and safer place. And what a better place than Los Alamos that not only values national security, but also ensuring that we empower our communities and better our communities surrounding us by outreach in science and things like that. And that's very notable here. After Oppenheimer went through the treadmill of the Manhattan Project, he was very adamant that we needed to make science that was becoming more and more complex to the general public more available. And he participated in a series of lectures by the BBC. And I strongly encourage you all to listen to them, because I swear you will fall in love with that passion and his eloquence and his love for science and knowledge and the responsibility that comes with it. And that's one of the reasons I stayed in Los Alamos. And as I moved from one organization, from the LAMP, Los Alamos Meson Physics, and Oppenheimer was very involved in the Meson research, to the weapons program, safety and surety, I keep finding OP around my career. So.
Thank you, Anna, very much for that. Kai, please.
So I'm only here because...
You wrote a book.
No, I'm only here because Marty Sherwin, my dear friend and a great historian, signed a contract to do a biography of Robert Oppenheimer in 1980. And 20 years later, literally in the year 2000, Marty came to me and said, Kai, I want you to join me on this project, and if you say no, my gravestone is going to read, he took it with him. And I tell that by way of introduction because Marty just, he spent 20 years literally researching Oppenheimer's life, and he became obsessed with it, and he got biographer's disease, which is common in the profession, actually. When if you try to do a history book, it's one thing, but if you try to do the life of another person, it becomes unending, and you worry about the one archive you haven't visited or the interview you haven't done. And so Marty became properly obsessed in that way. And by the year 2000, he'd accumulated 50,000 pages of archival documents from all over the world. And he'd done over 150 interviews of Oppie's students, fellow physicists, enemies. I was just really lucky to fall into this project. And it still took us another 5 years to finish and see the book in print. But it's an extraordinary story, and Oppenheimer is a really complex, fascinating personality, extremely intense, and his life tells just an important story for we Americans about the beginning of the atomic age, but also what happened to him 9 years after he became the most famous scientist in America. And I'll just end by saying that Marty, when he brought me aboard, he said, we would not be spending all these years working on this project, this life, if it was just a life about the father of the atomic bomb, just a story about the making of the atomic bomb. What really gives it an arc, a drama, is the tragedy that befell him 9 years after he was on the cover of Time and Life. And in 1954, he was put through this horrendous security hearing. And it's an incredible story, a drama, a court drama. All court dramas can be theatrical. This one is just riveting. And what happened to him was a black mark on the history of this country. And it's astonishing that last December, the Secretary of Energy, for all sorts of reasons that Tom and Tim can explain, made a decision to nullify that 1954 verdict, and it's a triumph.
Yeah, thank you, Kai, and thank you for mentioning Marty too. I should have done that during the introductions, because even though he's not with us here today, he kind of is, So we appreciate him.
Marty died at the age of 84 in October 21. Just 2 weeks after learning that Christopher Nolan was going to be doing this movie.
Yeah, we're very mindful of him today, of course, of Marty. And Tim, please share a little bit about your career with us.
So I am probably the least likely to be here. But maybe not so much, because my parents were here in 1944 and 1945. My father was a very young physicist, 22 years old. He had just joined the Army and then was told to report to 109 East Palace Avenue. And my mother came here with him. He worked as a young physicist for the rest of the time until the Trinity test and some months thereafter. He was at Alamogordo when the test was, when the test occurred, and my mother ran the nursery school here at Los Alamos at that time, and it was unquestionably one of the most memorable years of their lives, about which they would talk very fondly, and revered Oppenheimer. For them, he was really a larger-than-life figure, as were some of the other physicists here, like Niels Bohr and Hans Bethe and others. There are so many questions that I wish I'd asked them, but I could never imagine in a million years that I would be sitting here, I can tell you that. But the reason is because I did know a little bit about Robert Oppenheimer and how much he meant to them, but I also knew Kai, and while 50 years elapsed in the meantime, Kai came to me and told me about what had happened to Oppenheimer in the hearing that he just mentioned, and how Oppenheimer was really so subjected to this really gross miscarriage of justice, a real travesty that really was an attack on his character, his reputation, and all for political purposes. A process that would never be acceptable today. And yet it largely ended his professional career. And so it was that really motivated me to try to do something about that, because I felt that Oppenheimer's story shouldn't end there. And I can talk in much more detail about what happened in the years that I worked with Kai's help and others and Tom's to ultimately convince the now Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, a wonderful person, to make the decision that she did to repudiate and vacate that decision in a way that really, I think, is a much better end to the story of Robert Oppenheimer than would otherwise have been the case.
So we all know that that decision was made, but today you're going to get to hear the inside story behind that, because it wasn't easy. And,
No.
in a sense, it was many decades in the making. So we'll be talking about that in a few minutes. But before we do, one of our first questions is stories. Everybody likes a good historical story, right? And so I'm going to ask our panelists, and we'll see. Now, Kai's got a book full of them. But you know, is there a favorite Oppenheimer story to you? Something that was funny, something that was inspirational, something that would give us greater insight into J. Robert Oppenheimer? What do you think? And this is for the whole panel, whoever wants to jump in first.
Kai, you're the authority.
So I thought we'd go to Kai on this
A funny story, okay. You know, Oppenheimer, interesting thing, one of the interesting things to me about him is that he came from a very privileged background in New York. His family had a 10-room apartment on the Upper West Side. He had a cook, a nanny, a chauffeur, a sailboat on the Long Island Sound.
Van Gogh paintings.
And
the
sorry?
Van Gogh paintings.
And Van Gogh paintings. his mother was a painter and an art collector. His father had been an immigrant from Germany, but was a self-made man. And, you know, young Oppenheimer clearly, at a young age, he showed evidence of interest in science, a fabulous rock collection. He was good in chemistry. But even by his own description, he was a sort of repulsively arrogant young boy. At one point, speaking of a funny story, he's in the ethical culture school in class one day, and he turns to a classmate, a girl, and tells her, ask me a question in Greek and I will answer you in Latin. You know, he was actually, very smart, but socially awkward. And as a teenager, he had a very prolonged adolescence, and he was awkward in his relations with women. He he went through Harvard in 3 years, but then gets to graduate school in Cambridge, and he tries to be an experimental physicist, and he fails at it. He's awkward in the lab, breaks things, and this leads to his first sort of crisis, and he has what I think can only be called a nervous breakdown, and he almost didn't survive it. So he was a very actually fragile personality, and it's astonishing to see this fragile personality nevertheless sort of transform himself repeatedly into a good teacher, an administrator. When he had never administered more than a few graduate students, he arrives here in Los Alamos and becomes an incredibly charismatic leader. And it's just astonishing to watch him grow.
He learned. I mean, he learned from these mistakes that he made along the way. He had some really good mentors along the way as well. What else? Any other favorite?
He should have learned more. He should have learned more. Some of the issues that led to his demise were, how to say it, silly errors of judgment. Errors of judgment for a grown-up person.
So he learned, but at the same time,
Should have learned more.
should have. Yes. Maybe that's all of us to an extent.
I think it was Maria Gopper, Nobel Prize, who was in Harvard at the time, that told the professor to keep the prodigy boy under control, or otherwise the classmates were going to not show up into class, right? Because Oppenheimer kept interrupting the professor and so on. He was so curious. Some people say later in life that he had the answer ready before you were able to make the question, to pose the question.
Right.
He was that fast.
Right.
Yeah, I think actually he was not alone in kind of coming out of the Second World War, having been served in the Manhattan Project and being a veteran of it, and then later on encountering problems where his contributions and reputation actually couldn't carry him through the problems. The other example is Alvin Weinberg, who was the director at Oak Ridge, who similarly had gone through the Manhattan Project. He was the director at Oak Ridge for a long time, basically sort of depending on how you measure from the end of the 40s till 1974, when he was unceremoniously fired, and which caused him to go into a depression, and he had, periods of time where he had problems with prescription medication, and he wrote about this in his biography. And his downfall was partly due to the fact that he felt like, because of his reputation and contributions, he would be able to overcome resistance in the system to what he felt was the most important thing to do. And there's a little bit of that character in, I think, Oppenheimer in 54, first off, strongly felt that he hadn't done anything wrong. And I think he also felt that because he hadn't done anything wrong and he'd made these important contributions, it was going to be okay. And of course it wasn't. And so, there's probably a lesson somewhere in that.
Yeah, no, it's really, the trial is incredible how he walks into this storm and is completely naive about what he's about to face. Yeah. And I love the story that's in the book where he, shortly before going down to Washington to face the security panel that has been orchestrated by Louis Strauss, he goes to see his good friend Albert Einstein down the hall, where he's, of course, Albert's boss, right? He's the director of the institute. And he explains to Einstein that he's got to go down to Washington. He'll be absent for some weeks, and there's going to be this security hearing, and that he's being questioned. His loyalty to the country is being questioned. And Albert's kind of stunned, and he turns to Robert and he says, "But Robert, you are Mr. Atomic. Well, just walk away. You don't need, they don't want you, you don't need them." And Robert sort of says, no, you don't understand. I need to use my status and my influence to try to educate the people in Washington on what, how to do the right thing with things atomic. And I can't give my advice unless I have a security clearance. And this was a sort of an evidence of his complete political naivete. So Robert walks out. Albert watches him walking out. He turns to his secretary and he says, "There goes a nar." Nar is the Yiddish for a fool. And of course he was being foolish, and Einstein could see that he was being naively foolish. But Oppie he had set himself up. He had really antagonized Louis Strauss. And this too was a pattern of fault in his character, because he could be very sweet and patient and gentle with his students and strangers on the street. But he had a tendency, when confronted with someone who claimed to be on his level, someone in authority, someone who, like Louis Strauss, had a big ego and was claiming to understand quantum physics and claiming to be an equal. Oppie he would react to those kinds of people with rudeness, and he'd go out of his way to antagonize them. He did this with Strauss, he did this with Harry Truman.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm reminded of when this superconducting supercollider budget was under stress. The director of, and Congress was threatening to cut the funding. The director of the SSC said it's the revenge of the C students. And SSC was in trouble, but that sealed it, I mean, and
That's how Congress works.
yeah.
Well, if you're relatively new to this story of Oppenheimer's background is here, and we'll be talking a little bit about that in just a few minutes and how that could have materialized in the first place. I want to think about leadership a little bit. Of course, our director, one of Oppenheimer's successors, has been the director at Oak Ridge as well. As we think about leadership and what it takes to lead an institution like Los Alamos Oak Ridge, one of the other places in the complex, I guess the question is, first, why Oppenheimer? And then, could anyone else have been as successful?
It was a very bold move by Grooves.
It was a bold move and unexpected, right?
Oppenheimer was young. He had no administrative or management experience. He had been a professor. He might have had 13 or so postdocs and graduate students. But, and that was it. But he was internationally respected. He was very energetic, very passionate, this naivety, right? He was extremely passionate and very inspiring. And he had this ideal that science and knowledge had no borders. So it was really important to find solutions to very complex problems, to bring people from all over the world. Right? But for that, you needed someone that others respected, right? Other scientists around the world respected. And when he came here, he had to figure out how to house people. We went from 3,500 to 8,000 people in 6 months or something like that. And he had to be HR, recruiting, you know, and preventing the draft of scientists that were going to be sent to war, and then dealing with groups that was telling him, don't let the scientists talk to each other, otherwise the secrets are going to go away. And Oppenheimer was like, well, scientists need to talk, because it's this inbreed, you know, this mixing of ideas that leads to solution to complex problems. And he had to deal with things like groups saying, hey, your scientists are having babies. What are we going to do about it? Keep them busy. And things like that. And one of the things that I was chair of for a number of years was the PT colloquium, which was, a colloquium was a big deal. Oppenheimer insisted that for the science to shine, we needed these scientists, anyone with a bachelor's, you know, could attend to these colloquiums that were happening once a week, and where people from all over the lab were sharing their ideas and things like that, and it was ongoing, and Groves hated it. But Oppenheimer fought for the scientists to be able to shine in a military structure that was Los Alamos. So I think when Groves interviewed, I think it was Oppenheimer, or talked to Oppenheimer, or Oppenheimer said, we cannot have 3 different labs in 3 different geographic locations. That's not going to work. We need everyone in one place, right? So we can go to the ski hill and find our colleagues and talk about quantum physics and things like that. And I think that was his brilliance. And afterwards, he understood the power of what we built, and he worked very hard in the political arena on non-proliferation and the impact of the genie that we had created, and how important it was to establish international agreements. So he was a visionary in my mind, right? Was able to see the beginning to the end. And while he did research in many areas, some people say, why didn't he get the Nobel Prize then? Well, he was nominated 3 times, I think. He never got it. But if you just look at all the achievements, the different areas he worked in, and the fact that he was also guiding all these prima donnas at Los Alamos to shift them. We shift from the thin man to the fat man, just stop what you're doing and now focus there. I think it takes quite a person to do that, and not to get people getting out of here.
Yes.
Yeah, in terms of the, you know, why Oppenheimer, part of the reason was that there wasn't a lot of choice. A lot of the maybe more obvious people had already been put to work on radar. Right? You remember there were 2 seminal sort of physics contributions coming out of these very focused R&D efforts in the Second World War. One of them was obviously the bomb, but the other was radar. And that got moving a little bit faster. So a lot of the maybe more senior experienced people were working, you know, at MIT on the radar effort, and that, you know, limited the potential pool. On the question of could anyone else have done it, a couple years ago, we found a really interesting letter in the archives at Oak Ridge, which are stored in the basement of the graphite reactor, that was, they keep them there for the environmental management program. You know, sometimes you dig a hole and you find something, and it's like, well, why is that there? So you got to go figure that out. And it was a letter that was written after the war by Alvin Weinberg and Ed Kreutz. They were given the farm hall transcripts, which were when the German scientists were pulled out of Germany at the end of the war. They were taken to farm hall. All their conversations were recorded. And they also had all the German publications from the German nuclear effort. And so they were asked, you know, do an analysis of this, and let's, you know, what's the risk that someone else is going to be able to do this? And they wrote this really interesting letter that basically said, well, clearly, you know, they knew that Heisenberg was a good physicist, and there were lots of good physicists. And from the transcripts, you know, particularly at the time when the bomb was dropped, and, you know, it didn't take them very long to figure out what had happened, and the publications they written, they said, clearly they understood the physics. And in fact, the final paragraph has this great line, because they were focused on this question of, is someone else going to be able to do this? And they said, well, another country getting the bomb is mainly a matter of procurement. And what they meant by procurement was the material, getting the enriched uranium or the plutonium. That is a huge barrier. The physics of the bomb is knowable and known. And certainly, I think it's probably fair to say that little boy, if you've got the highly enriched uranium, you can make that work. You probably don't need an Oppenheimer to make little boy work. After all, we didn't even test it before we used it. That's how confident we were it was going to work. I think that the thing where you can point to him making a difference was not, are you going to get a bomb? Or even, are you going to make little boy work? It was the fat man and, how to respond when the measurements were done with the plutonium that came from the graphite reactor. Yeah. And, it was discovered that the thin man wasn't going to work. And I think there you can say, a different person than Oppenheimer, it is not at all clear to me that would have come together on a timeline that would have allowed it to impact in the way that it did. And that was important for two reasons. One, we only had enough HEU for one weapon, and the production timeline associated with getting enough HEU for a second weapon meant it was actually quite a ways off. And to the extent that you weren't going to decisively end the war, and there's lots of debate about this, did we need to drop the second bomb and all that sort of stuff, but to the extent that you needed to demonstrate this wasn't a one-off, if you don't surrender, there's more coming, you needed Fat Man to do that. And in addition, in order to have any kind of prospect of having any kind of arsenal that became relevant in the context of the Soviet Union after the war, you had to have the plutonium weapons. And I think that the timeliness of that is one where I think without Oppenheimer things could have been very different.
So Tom, what did he do to solve that problem that made the difference? He just pursued the plutonium project in a way that was...
Yeah, when the measurements that were done by Segre at the cabin, which is part of the Manhattan Project National Historic Park, revealed that there's a problem with spontaneous fission because of the buildup of 240, he just very decisively said, all hands on deck, we're going to change gears and pursue this other idea that up to that point had been kind of a sideline of the implosion device. And it was a seminal moment for Project, I was going to say the lab, but technically it wasn't the lab then, it was Project Y. Seminal moment to say, this path that we've been going down will not work, and we need to uproot everybody and everything we've been doing and focus on this other thing. And to be honest, it would have been easy, I think, to not make that decisive in action, to sort of to say, well, maybe we can make it work. Now, from a physics point of view, I think it was pretty clear, and that's where having someone who had the credibility, among the scientists to be able to say, we're going to upend everything that you've been working on going down this other direction was pretty important.
And time-wise, that happened in 44.
Yeah,
we didn't get plutonium here until February 45.
Well, I think they had microgram quantities of cyclotron plutonium from Berkeley, but that doesn't answer this question. It was only when they got the graphite reactor plutonium from Oak Ridge that we were able to discover the problem. So, they were pretty far down the road of a different path.
So I'm interested in your mentioning of Heisenberg, because Oppie, as a young man, had listened to lectures of Heisenberg in Germany, and his motivation, I think, for working on the Manhattan Project was precisely that he feared Heisenberg.
Heisenberg was good.
And he knew he was capable.
Yeah.
And so those farm hall transcripts that's a really interesting mystery too. You know, there was a play actually done, Copenhagen, about this whole.
I saw it a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and so that opens up the question of what did the Germans do wrong? Did they just not have an Oppenheimer? Or did Heisenberg?
That could lead into a long discussion. and maybe we can follow that up.
Yeah.
We'll see if our audience is interested in following up on that maybe during Q&A, because I think that's an interesting story. And, you know, as I think about Tom's comments, of course, those decisions that Oppenheimer made were not necessarily that popular with everyone at the laboratory. So he was willing to make difficult decisions. You know, as we, you know, not to completely leave behind the Germans quite yet, but, you know, we think about Oppenheimer's motivation for being involved in the project. And I want Kai to start us out with this. You know, when I think of Oppenheimer, you know, there are certain words that come to mind. Maybe complexity is at the top of the list. Another one is conflicted. Can you speak to that some? We already have a little bit today, Kai, but maybe you could share with our audience some thoughts, and we'll see what our other panelists think as well.
Yeah, you know, what's also really interesting about Oppenheimer is that I think he was a good physicist in part because he was also a polymath, and he loved French poetry and the novels of Ernest Hemingway, and you know, he had a sensitive soul, and he was curious about not only the physical world and quantum, but he was curious about you know, politics in the midst of the Depression, why capitalism wasn't working. He was curious about the Gita and the Hindu scriptures, so much so that he learned Sanskrit enough to read the Gita in the original. And so he was a good physicist for precisely that reason, I think. And he was good at being able to be a charismatic leader because he was familiar with literature and poetry. And so when, you know, in the summer of 1945, he is focused on making this Trinity test work. And the story I think that Alan wants me to tell is
No pressure.
one of my few contributions to the research beyond Marty Sherwin's massive archive was I learned in soon after I was brought aboard that Oppenheimer's last secretary at Los Alamos was a woman named Ann Wilson. And I discovered that she was living about 1.5 miles away from my house in Washington, D.C. She was living in Georgetown, so I sought her out, got a great interview in which she told me the following story, that one day, just after the Trinity test, she was walking to work with Robert, and he suddenly started muttering, looking down at the ground, those poor little people, those poor little people. And she stopped him and said, "Robert, what are you talking about?" And he says, "Well, you know, now we know Trinity, it works, the gadget works, and now it's going to be used." I don't think he knew exactly how, but on which cities and such. But and the victims are going to be people in a whole city, because it needs that big of a target. And those poor little people. So I conveyed this anecdote back to Marty Sherwin, who quickly realized that from the chronology that this was actually in the same week that Oppie was giving a briefing to the bombardiers, some of which were going to be on the plane that would drop the weapon. And he was instructing them at exactly what altitude it should be detonated to have the maximum destructive power. So he's doing two things at once that are extremely difficult to hold in your head, you know, to do your duty and carry out your responsibilities to make this thing work, to make the gadget work in the most efficient destructive way possible, and yet he was worrying about the tragic consequences of the people who were going to suffer the results. And that made him very human, I think.
So too. Any other thoughts from our panel on that? Some of you may have a follow-up question about that during the Q&A session about how he felt about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We also got to talk about that a little bit earlier today, and his view of that over the years. I have a question for Anna. I want to kind of go back in time for a moment. Now, I know some of you who are Tim Reeser fans are concerned that I haven't brought, but I've got a really good question for Tim coming up. And of course, if you have any grievances for Congress, you can also lodge those with Tim as well.
Yeah. We can solve them all today.
We go get it all taken care of. But I want to go back to Anna, and of course, when we think about Oppenheimer and his life and all of the different things that he did, I think it's interesting that a lot of times his science gets overlooked. And Anna, you're a member, and I'm going to put in the plug. So Anna is also a member of the J. Robert Oppenheimer Memorial Committee, which tonight is the annual lecture, free and open to the public, over at Dwayne Smith Auditorium. So you're all invited to attend that next, if you don't get enough today, right? So that'll be coming up. But as a scientist, Anna, and of course everyone else is welcome on our panel as well to chime in on this too. You mentioned that he was nominated on multiple occasions for the Nobel Prize. He was a very creative scientist. Tell us a little bit about what he did and why it matters.
So he, after finishing his PhD, he went to Europe, where he learned from the greatest quantum mechanics minds of the European schools. And when he came back, he was determined to build a school of theoretical physics in this country. And he applied relativistic quantum mechanics to any subject he could get his hands on. From photoelectric effect, astrophysics, cosmic rays, absorption edges, to the way we understand, we were able to decipher from a quantum standpoint the behavior of molecules, where we kind of decouple the behavior of the electrons from the behavior of the nucleus and things like that. So when you look at his publications or the research of his students, you realize that in the same day, I read that he was meeting with his students once a day, and he might have like 12 students in total. And they were going from emission, quantum mechanics, astrophysics, a very broad range. So even the prediction of the positron, or mesons, or some instability in the collapse of stars and predicted black hole, the potential existence of black holes, which was not experimentally discovered until after his passing, right? So he worked all over the place, and I think in this country he deserves a lot of credit in bringing this science to Princeton and the University of California, and build that school that then fed all the national laboratories here in the US. And it was his approach in engaging younger staff, rather than very hierarchical, a very democratic type of status of freedom of ideas, questions, answers, very fast, challenging his students, right? That led to these great discoveries and as I say, the building of this school here in the US. Otherwise, those Europeans were taking the lead.
It's important to note that before the Second World War, American physics was pretty backwoods. Yeah. If you read Wigner's biography, autobiographical memoirs, whatever, he talks about the fact that, one of the reasons Wigner wanted to go to Princeton was he felt like, it's not a very good university, but it has potential. If we can just bring some of the quality of European physics to the Princeton physics department, they could really do something. and that's the way it was at the time. Physics was, cutting edge physics was a European activity. Experimentally, it was Rutherford, and in theory, it was in Germany. And all the best people went to Europe to learn that. And it was, actually partially as a byproduct of the Manhattan Project that US physics rose to preeminence, but it was the bringing back of these ideas from places like Göttingen and Berlin and Cambridge that created the American physics of the 21st century. Oppenheimer was part of that.
As we consider this as well, Oppenheimer's contributions in importing physics, if you will, in publications, and I think I may be mistaken on this. I know we have fact checkers in the audience, but I think that paper on black holes didn't use the term back then, but I think that it was published the day Nazi Germany invaded Poland.
Oh, really?
Now, do check
Fact
on
checkers.
that, make sure. But a lot of these important events overlapping simultaneously. One other thing that I was curious about Kai's thoughts on this was as a teacher of physics as well. Now, Oppenheimer was naturally a wonderful teacher. Is that true, Kai?
No,
Not in the beginning.
not in the beginning at all. He was very shy, awkward. He spoke with this very soft voice. There's tapes you can go on the web now and hear his voice, and it's very spooky. It's a very spooky voice, very soft spoken. He would get up at the blackboard in the beginning, and there are these stories where he would write these formula and then wipe it off and write some more formula, and then turn to his students and try to get a discussion going. And they're confused because they don't know what he's talking about, and he's saying, "Oh no, I don't mean that formula. I mean the one underneath, the one I erased." And he would, speak to them by lecturing with his back to them. I mean, he was terrible, but somehow he was able to learn how to transform himself into just a charismatic teacher. And you're right, Anna, he was very democratic in his instincts. He, worked with his graduate students and give and take kind of conversational strategy of learning. And that black hole paper, very short, that he wrote in 1939, he co-authored with one of his graduate students. So he was very sweet in helping his students along, and he became extremely popular with, they were called the Oppie Boys at Berkeley.
And he was very social with his students. He would take the students out to eat at fancy restaurants because he came from a higher.
Yes, he had a little money.
Yeah, and he would take his students, and he was so unaware of what was going on. I mean, the crisis of the stock market, he learned about it after the fact, right? Because he was so immersed. But he took his students, he organized tons of gatherings at his house and restaurants. He would take them to concerts, music. He valued culture and that relationship. So I agree that he evolved, he learned, and I think he was pretty much admired by his students.
Now, there's a couple more topics I want us to try and cover as a panel before we open up the floor to you. And we don't have it. It's remarkable how fast time goes by in events like this, already an hour in. Of course, I think it is important, as Kai already alluded to reflect on the Oppenheimer security clearance hearing of 1954, which remains timely to this day. If you're unfamiliar with this story, now Kai's also referred to Oppenheimer as being sweet a couple times, which he was. Not all the time, though. And in some of those instances where he was maybe not so sweet, maybe a little bit of tone deaf, he did make enemies from time to time. Eventually, some of those enemies became politically quite prominent and abused their power at the height of the McCarthy era in 1953, 1954. That, if you're interested in getting into the details more, this panel is certainly equipped to do that, and we can do that during Q&A. What I'm interested more in from our panelists is in more recent events, and I want to turn it over to Tim now. So Tim, I think everybody here knows that in December of last year, December 2022, the DOE, Department of Energy, officially vacated the entire hearing process and essentially issued an apology as well. Now, there have been efforts to do something to rectify this situation of Oppenheimer, one of our great wartime heroes, being treated in this manner. None of those had been successful, despite great effort up to that point. And I think Anna's familiar with some of these as a member of the Oppenheimer Memorial Committee. But Tim, can you tell us a little bit about some of those efforts in the past that weren't successful, but then what was different this time? You were in the middle of, very much a driver of that process. Can you tell us a little bit about the past, but then a little bit about more recent events?
So really soon after the hearing and the verdict against Oppenheimer, after a process that was rife with unethical, improper, illegal, and really outrageous abuses of any semblance of fairness or due process against him, as Kai has called it, really a conspiracy against Oppenheimer to discredit him, to humiliate him, and ultimately to remove him from the debate on the future use of nuclear weapons and the development of more powerful nuclear weapons. Soon after the hearing, hundreds of scientists from Los Alamos and elsewhere petitioned for the Atomic Energy Commission to reverse that decision, because they revered Oppenheimer, as did my parents. People who worked with him for all the reasons that have been described. He was such a charismatic, inspiring, brilliant person who probably was the only person who could have brought together such an amazing team of scientists and provided the direction and the inspiration for what was really an astonishing accomplishment. And yet that went nowhere. The Atomic Energy Commission didn't change its mind. And years went by. In 2011, actually we should back up. Only 9 years later, President Kennedy, and Kai can speak to the details, I think recognizing that a real grave injustice had been done, decided to award Oppenheimer with the highest scientific prize, the prize named after Enrico Fermi. And then Kennedy was assassinated, but President Johnson went ahead with the ceremony and awarded Oppenheimer this prize at the White House. But that really didn't address the underlying travesty that had occurred. And then years went by, and it was really Senator Bingaman from New Mexico that sent a long letter to then Secretary of Energy Chu in the early days of President Obama, urging that the decision should be nullified, and laying out the whole case. Really did an outstanding job of doing that. And unfortunately, Bingaman ended up retiring. Chu never really, as a result, did anything. And looking back, all the evidence was there. It should have happened long before, but for a variety of reasons, like the fact that there were those who felt that, well, it was not a black and white issue, and so easy to just stay away from it. And it was only some years later that, after that effort failed, Kai, who I had known for many years, came to me, and he and Marty described what had happened to Oppenheimer and why we should try to do something about it, because it really was an outrageous abuse of authority against, the most important scientists of that era, who had contributed so much to the country and who was so revered by everyone in the scientific community. And and I also had a personal interest because of my parents who had talked about Oppenheimer and clearly felt that, their experience here, working for him, under him, was really one of the most memorable times of their lives. And so, the more I understood what had happened, the more outrageous it seemed, and that really the story of Robert Oppenheimer should not have ended there. And so we felt strongly that the United States government, having done this to him, needed to make amends for what had happened. And that resulted in a letter from Senator Leahy, who had been a prosecutor for many years. He was the chairman of our Judiciary Committee, ultimately became the chairman of the Appropriations Committee and the president pro tem of the Senate. So he had a lot of seniority and a lot of influence. And he felt very strongly also that what had happened to Oppenheimer was just inexcusable and indefensible. And so we sent a letter to President Obama urging that the decision of the Atomic Energy Commission be vacated. And didn't hear anything for quite a long time, but eventually what happened was that then Secretary Moniz, a nuclear physicist, I think got very poor advice from his staff, and for a variety of reasons decided not to do what we were urging, and ended up creating a fellowship named after Robert Oppenheimer, which really wasn't what we were trying to accomplish. And so then we were very disappointed about that, and then Donald Trump was elected, and nothing happened for 4 years. But then after President Obama was elected, I decided to... Biden was elected. I decided to kind of resurrect this effort, and Kai and I talked more about it, and wrote another letter, in this case to President Biden, but very similar to the letter that we had sent to President Obama, and Senator Leahy and 3 other senators, including the senator from New Mexico, Martin Heinrich, signed it, and didn't hear anything. So, I waited for a while, and months went by, and finally, actually what had happened in the interim was I had bought this ping pong table on Craigslist. And it turned out that the person I had bought it from was a staff member for Al Franken in the Senate. And really nice guy. And so I got to know him, and he then became the director of the Federation of American Scientists. And then later, an official in the Department of Energy. And so, I didn't hear anything, and I was really kind of worried that this was all going to sort of get lost and forgotten. And so I called him up and I said, hey, we wrote this letter, and can you find out where it is, what's happened? And so maybe a week or two later, he got back to me and said, well, I found the letter, but I don't think you're going to get a different response. So I said, okay, don't answer it. I'm going to send another letter. And so then I spent about 7 months talking to Kai, ultimately talking to Tom and others who knew far more about Robert Oppenheimer than I did, rewriting that letter in a way that really more clearly addressed some of the issues that I think might have been part of the reason why previous attempts had failed. Most importantly was that we weren't asking that Robert Oppenheimer's security clearance, which had been revoked, be restored, because that would have involved or required another hearing, a fair hearing, one that was really consistent with due process and transparency and all the protections that anyone who's accused, as he was, are entitled to. We couldn't do that. He had been dead for 50 years. But we could at least repudiate what had occurred. And so we made clear in the letter that that's what we were asking for. We weren't asking that his security clearance be restored, but rather that the process, the decision that had resulted from this travesty of a hearing be nullified. And over that 7 or 8 months, Senator Leahy and I convinced 43 senators to sign that letter, both Republicans and Democrats. And I think the reason that we were able to, because most of them had never thought about Robert Oppenheimer, didn't know anything about what had happened to him. This was all ancient history, and injustices happen all the time in life. And so why should we care about this one in particular? And I think clearly the answer was Robert Oppenheimer was a very unique person in the history of this country. His contributions were unparalleled. Even the hearing didn't find him to have been disloyal. He was by no means a security risk. There wasn't a shred of evidence he had ever divulged anything that was in the nature of secret information. The charges against him were all about character assassination based on his associations with other people. And so I think over time we were able to convince people that not only was this a grave injustice perpetrated against, a real hero of American history, but also that it had real relevance today for scientists at a time when science and scientists were being attacked during the COVID pandemic and for other reasons. And we felt it was really important to use this example to reaffirm the importance of scientists being able to express views, controversial views on issues that require give and take, as Anna described, where exchanges of views often that may be the result of real deep disagreements aren't going to result in the government jeopardizing your career or attacking your reputation, that we really felt it was as relevant today as it was back then.
So Tim, just to interrupt, so one tipping point was getting 43 senators to sign a letter urging nullification. But I think the other tipping point was when you reached out to Tom here and you got him to reach out to all the living
exactly.
former
directors. Because I was not confident that even a letter with 43 senators would make the difference, because the Secretary of Energy is not a scientist. And I was worried that she would just not feel this was something she wanted to take on or feel confident that she could make a decision about. And so I felt we needed more input from scientists. And so that's when I contacted Tom, and Tom can describe what he did. And I also contacted the director of the Idaho National Laboratory and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. My father had become the chairman of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists for many years, and the Federation of American Scientists and the American Physical Society. They all weighed in their own ways in writing letters to the secretary to complement the letter that the senators sent.
So this effort. So this effort itself produced several historical documents. And one of them is, as you alluded to, was the director's letter. And so some of you here may remember that shortly after this announcement was made back in December, I believe there was a Landell Today article, and there was a copy. There was a PDF copy of the director's letter. I see some heads nodding yes. Hopefully you had the opportunity to read that, because I think that that's something that's going to be referred to for a long time as people reflect on this history. But Tom, how did that come into existence?
Well, Tim sent me an email and said, we're trying to build this case, and would you, as the Los Alamos director, be willing to write a letter in support of it? I've reached out to some of your colleagues, and I think it would be helpful. And so I was, when Ernie Moniz took on this question, I was the director at Oak Ridge. And so I'd sort of watched that happen because he spoke to the lab directors and sort of explained his thinking. And the concern that, at that time, the way it was framed was as restoring Oppenheimer's clearance. That was the way it was framed. And, I think Ernie actually went into this wanting to do that. He is a physicist and sort of knew the story. But, as it worked its way through the DOE bureaucracy, the concern that ultimately led him to go down the path of instead naming the Oppenheimer Science and Energy Leadership Program after Oppenheimer was the fact that one of the things that was discussed in the security hearing was the instance in a prior, adjudication, I guess, of his security clearance, Oppenheimer not been fully truthful about the Chevalier incident, which he acknowledged in the 1954 security hearing. In fact, that's where he made the famous quote about, it was a cock and bull story and all that. So he was forthcoming that he'd not been truthful, but he had not been truthful in essentially what we would say today, your background investigation. Didn't quite have that process. And so there was a concern that if we restored his clearance, that would send somehow the wrong message because we expect people to be truthful in their background investigations. In fact, it wasn't that long ago in 2019 that we terminated an employee from this lab for lying on their SF-86, and in fact, they were charged, pled guilty, and were convicted to that. And so there was a concern about mixed messages, and that was what led Ernie to say, I don't think we can do that. He had the general counsel and the security people, and how these things work in the department, that ultimately pushed it down a different path. So when Tim sent me the email, I thought, if we ask the same question, we're probably going to get the same answer. So we need to kind of reframe it. And so I reached out to some of my colleagues, the other lab directors, who'd also, written letters. Sig Hecker, had written actually a very thoughtful letter, and said, what do you guys think about this? Because I'm concerned that we'll get the same answer. And actually, it was interesting. There was a diversity of opinion in that group. Sig felt very strongly that, actually he felt the security clearance ought to be restored. Oppenheimer was loyal. There was no threat to security. There were others who felt like, yeah, but there's this, we do expect people to be truthful. It was a little bit complicated, as Oppenheimer was complicated. What we found, though, was when you said, well, was the loyalty hearing right? Is that an appropriate thing? We all agreed. I mean, it was clear it was an egregious wrong. So we were all on the same page in terms of vacating the result of that hearing, even though on the topic of restoring it, it was a little more complicated. So, I felt like maybe that's the path forward. We need to reframe this to be about, acknowledging the wrong. And so what the letter that we wrote said, basically, vacate the hearing and apologize. And part of the rationale for that was in sort of researching the letter. Alan provided me with, as you would expect, lots of good historical context, including, actually interesting, the New York Times article that was written when Oppenheimer received the Fermi Award, where it was actually acknowledged in a kind of deep background. It didn't say who it came from, but it was clearly sourced highly within the US government. First off, that the Fermi Award was an acknowledgement that the security hearing had been a wrong, and also that Oppenheimer had been given the opportunity to have his clearance restored and declined. And this apparently happened at a dinner at the White House.
Well, he was given the opportunity for another hearing.
Another hearing,
yeah.
And this was at a dinner at the White House with Glenn Seaborg. So I think it was probably Glenn Seaborg, who, of course, was a good friend. And he said, not on your life or something, no way I'm going through that again. So I kind of felt like, well, he was given the chance to go through that process of restoring the hearing, and he said, I don't want to do that. And in any case, we couldn't redo a fair hearing now after all these years, everyone is deceased. So that's the wrong remedy, whereas this vacating it and acknowledging it, was really what was necessary to kind of set the record straight. And so that was the letter that we wrote, which Kai was helpful in because it turned out he was here at around the time that this was happening because he'd been asked if he wanted to visit the set of the movie. So we had dinner, we had a great conversation about this, and that was very helpful in kind of framing this the right way. And he even reviewed our letter to make sure it was historically accurate, which was good also because there were a few corrections that we had to make. I think the other thing that was, I don't know to what extent this was useful, but Tim made the point that Secretary Granholm is not a physicist, but she is a lawyer. And she was the Attorney General of the state of Michigan. And one of the things that Alan had in the archives was a 100-page article from the Stanford Law Review about the hearing, and also an article that was written by the AEC lawyer who had to tell Oppenheimer that his clearance was revoked and resigned in protest when the results came out from the hearing. And in the 70s, he wrote an article, I think it was in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist maybe, describing that process. And as I said, the secretary is not a physicist, but she's a lawyer. And this, I think, really spoke to the violations of due process that were something that would resonate with her. She also, actually, I was going to say she read American Prometheus, but I think the accurate thing is she listened to it on Amazon or whatever, whole thing. So she really dug into this to understand it. And Jill Ruby was also, I think, extremely helpful in making the case why it was important to do this. There was an interesting interview with Alex Wellerstein, who's a historian of these things. He wrote the history of restricted data, which is something everyone here should read. It's probably kind of a geeky, niche book, but it's our niche. And he was interviewed on the NewsHour in December when it was announced, and was asked, why do you think the Secretary of Energy did this? And he gave, I don't think he was aware of all the stuff that we've just described. He didn't know, exactly what led to it. But he gave what I thought was a pretty good answer. He said, I'm not really sure because, if you're leading a large bureaucratic organization on an issue like this, the safest thing is to do nothing. Because you can be criticized for doing something. That's why the letter from the 43 senators was actually really important, because Secretary of Energy has an agenda of things she's trying to get done, and she probably does not want some big controversy to sideswipe it. So having the letter from the senators kind of says, this is okay, it's not going to take you off your agenda.
That was a real fear of ours.
Yeah.
Because, she runs a big agency. She's got a lot of issues to deal with.
Yeah.
This one obviously was not one that her staff would have brought to her.
Yeah.
And we wanted to make it as strong a case as possible, and so accumulated all this documentation, and the letter that Tom wrote and his predecessors signed was really critical. And I put it all in a binder and got on my bicycle and went down to hand deliver it to the Department of Energy, because I did not want it to get lost in the mail or anything. And but then I didn't hear
10 bicycles all over D.C.
Yeah. Then I didn't hear anything for a month. And, I was worried because Senator Leahy was going to retire. He served in the Senate for 48 years. And I really wanted this decision to happen before he retired. And so I kept, asking what's happening, and Kai would ask me, and weeks went by. And then finally, I got sort of an inkling that she was likely to make the decision that we were asking for, but nothing definitive. And I also was worried that, it might not go the whole way. I really wanted the decision to be dispose of this issue once and for all, not to be any kind of equivocal statement that could be interpreted in different ways. So, I asked them, like, before she says anything, please tell me what she's going to say. And finally, my ping pong table friend called me up and said, okay, she's going to vacate the decision. And I said, okay, well, what's she going to say? And he read me the statement, and it was better than anything I could have written myself. And it was, just such an amazing culmination of so many years by so many people to really rectify such an outrageous miscarriage of justice against, one of the great scientists in our history. So that at least the story of Robert Oppenheimer didn't end where it otherwise would have. Yes. And we can at least say that, and thanks to the secretary, who is just a really fine person, and I arranged for Senator Leahy to thank her in a phone call, and Senator Leahy was kind of late to get on the call, so I was talking to her and thanked her for doing so, and she said, I knew almost immediately that I wanted to do this, but I just needed to be sure of all the facts, and so she read the book, and not many...
Listen to the book.
Listen to the book. Not many cabinet officials would have done that, so she really deserves a lot of credit for the effort that she made. And
apparently she did say it was kind of long.
Well, she was right about
Sorry.
that.
Well, I've gone over our allotted time, which probably won't go down well with our sponsors today. But I do have one more question, and and this one's for Kai as we close it out. And hopefully you have many questions. I'm planning to stick around, so are our panelists, for a little while.
And I have a quote that is very important.
We have a quote. So Anna will be sharing with that with us momentarily. So this is, we've had kind of a retrospective of J. Robert Oppenheimer, his life and his career, but we've also made mention of the movie that's coming out next month as well. You probably have movie questions. I'm going to get Kai to answer one of them for you. Now, I know nothing about the movie. I'm asked all the time, Alan, what did you do for the movie? Nothing is the answer to that, But I know a guy.
We did offer.
We did try.
We tried to
we
offer
certainly
up
tried.
behind the behind the fence scenes, but I don't think they wanted to mess with government bureaucracy.
Yeah, they must
know
have heard.
what happens when you screw up.
They must have heard. So we did try, but I know a guy who has seen the movie already, and his name is Kai Bird, and he's up here on the stage with us today. And so Kai, as we close things out, can you tell us a little bit about your screening of the film and how you felt about it at the conclusion?
Well, the first that I heard that there was going to be a movie was in September of 21 when I got a phone call saying, Christopher Nolan wants to talk to you. And quite frankly, I had to turn to my wife and say, who's Christopher Nolan? I don't keep up with Hollywood the way I should. But anyway, we had a nice phone call. We had a nice meeting a few weeks later. But he made it clear that he had picked up the film option, but he had written a screenplay all on his own that previous spring and summer after reading the book. And he wasn't sharing it with me, that he works confidentially. But then he changed his mind just in February of 2022, just before he started to film. And he called me back up to New York and put me in a hotel room, handed me the script, and told me, you have as long as you need to read it. And it took me 3.5 hours. It's a long script. It's a long book, but the movie is almost 3 hours. And about 3 weeks ago, he invited me out to LA, and the next morning took me into a IMAX theater, huge IMAX theater, that was completely empty. And he sat me in the middle of the theater, and then he walked away and sat at the side, giving me privacy to watch it on my own. And here I am alone in this huge theater watching this movie with the creator of the movie. And it was an emotional experience. I mean, it was, I can't blow the plot, okay?
Right. No spoilers. No spoilers.
But in my opinion, it is an amazing cinematic experience in color IMAX and black and white IMAX. And it's artistically just a stunning achievement. And fortunately for the biographer, I think it also is very accurately reflective of the history. He bends over backwards to try to tell the story, and it is deeply biographical about the man. And so I'm hopeful that if Marty Sherman was with us on the stage today, he too would be pleased and looking forward to the movie. And I'm hopeful that it will start a real national conversation about the history of both Oppenheimer the man, but of Los Alamos, and most importantly of the McCarthy era that we are still living with, the residue of. And so I think it's a terrific, I think it's going to be good. But cross my fingers.
2 thumbs up from Kai Bird. Can't ask much more than that. Well, Kai, thanks for sharing that with us. And Anna, did you want to share your statement now, or do you want to wait until?
Yes. Alan mentioned that I'm the vice chair of the J. Robert Oppenheimer Memorial Committee,
Yes.
which was formed about more than 50 years ago because of all the things you heard here. This committee is a nonprofit that aims at honoring the legacy, the ethical and intellectual legacy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. And many of the people that, like Fred Reeby, that went through the lab asking for signatures to reverse that decision, but the AAC being members of that committee. So we were ecstatic when we heard that after many years, the Memorial Committee went through, we started with lawyers, when we had handy, then we went through legislative and executive realms. But as a scientist here at Los Alamos, when I read Senator Leahy's statement, it just warmed my heart. And I wanted everybody to hear it if you didn't read it. He said, after a couple of paragraphs, this decision also reaffirms that government scientists, whether renowned like Oppenheimer or a technician laboring in obscurity, including those who risk their careers to warn of safety concerns or to express unpopular opinions on matters of national security, can do so freely, and that their cases will be fairly reviewed based on facts, not personal animus or politics. As a scientist, that's precious.
And I think that on that note, right. And so I'm so grateful that you shared that with us. I think that and our movie review was a great way to end our formal remarks, which again, they went a bit longer than usual. That's never happened to me. But now, again, I want to thank our panelists and all the people that they've worked with behind the scenes to make this day possible, and the December announcement from the Secretary possible as well. Now it's your turn. What questions do you have for the panel that we've put together for you today? And one thing is, we're waiting for our first one. I would like to recover that director's letter from DOE to put in the NSRC if there's a way to do that. We will give it a very good home. Let's see, so we have a question back here.
Hi, I'm a recent hire with the NSRC, and so I read your book, Hi, as part of my research. So in your book, Robert's brother Frank stated, Robert seemed to divide the world into people who were worth his time and those who were not. For the former group, it was wonderful. Robert wanted everything and everyone to be special. Later on, you talk about his relationship with his kids, and we all think of him as the kind of like father of the atomic bomb, but like he's also a father and had some really kind of interesting relationships with his two kids. At one point, he kind of didn't see his newborn kid for 3 months and, asked a friend if they wanted to adopt her. So I just was wondering if you could speak at all in your research or Marty's research about the kind of man that he was behind the scenes of the lab.
Yes, at one point in his Los Alamos years, Oppie is focused, working so hard on the project, and he has a young son, Peter, and then suddenly Tony is born, and Kitty goes through postpartum depression and announces that she's going back to visit her parents, and so he's stuck with Tony and Peter. And yes, there was, we interviewed the woman who he offered, do you want to adopt Tony? She's so lovely. But he did so, I think, out of anguish that he had no time to spend with her and take care of her. And, he was feeling guilty as being a father. Anyway, he tried to be very hard. He tried very hard to be a good father. But, fathers always fail to one extent or another, and so did Oppie.
Thank you for the question. We have another one.
Yes, I have another one. And actually, it's a good follow-on to hers. I am reading your book. I'm not listening to it. I'm reading it. I'm about halfway through. And you might talk about this later in the book, but I'm curious about Kitty Oppenheimer, because in the first half of the book, you talk about her wanting very much for her husband to succeed in his role and coming to Los Alamos, but then her being very unfulfilled in Los Alamos because she can't pursue her own career. It sounds like she wasn't too thrilled about being a mom. And so anyway, I'm curious about what her ambitions were for her husband and sort of and again, this is going to maybe spoil later in the book for me, but kind of what the relationship was like later in terms of her feelings towards him and his success and her sidelining her career for him.
Well, Kitty is just a fabulous character. I mean, she is vivacious and outgoing, and she met Oppenheimer when she was 27, 28 years old, and she was already married for the third time.
A widow, right? Huh? A widow.
And she had been a widow too, but she had married again.
A widow, and then a divorce.
Yes,
she found all three mechanisms.
All three in her 20s. And then she fell in love with Oppie, and they had a very eventful marriage. It was, she was unhappy in Los Alamos. She couldn't pursue her biology studies. She couldn't, for a time she was working, in the medical center, doing studies of radiation on human beings, but it wasn't the work she wanted to do, and she had found it difficult to be a good mother, and but they had an amazing relationship. She was devoted to him, and she was also troubled in her relationship to alcohol at times, and yet he stood by her, and during the trial, that's the amazing thing. She was a tiger. And you read the transcript of the trial, and you are angry and frustrated with Oppie's performance, his sort of unwillingness to defend himself aggressively. And Kitty was just the opposite. She got on the witness stand and took on the prosecutor and ridiculed his questions and made it clear that she wasn't, standing for this nonsense. And yet the whole family was wounded by the trial. It was a terrible experience, particularly for young Peter, who was a teenager by that time, and was painfully aware of what his father was going through.
And maybe thanks to Kitty's ambitions, I think Oppenheimer, correct me if I'm wrong, worked with the University of California, that Project Y was aligned with, to change the anti-nepotism rules, allowing spouses to work in the same lab as the scientists, allowing all those spouse women to be useful while their husbands were working frantically, because very often they had a career and there was nothing else to do up here. So I believe that Oppie advocated for that to be changed because University of California did not allow spouses to work in the same laboratory.
That's one of those examples of personalities of labs that persist over time, because we still have a very high fraction of dual career couples compared to other comparable institutions.
That's interesting. Yeah.
It's a combination of the history and the people and the decisions and the location.
Right.
Well, thank you for the question. We've got a couple at the back microphone that have been waiting, then we'll come right back up here.
Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. So my question is about Oppenheimer being a conflicted person. I thought it was very interesting to learn that he apparently fought so hard to keep his security clearance to advise our government on the use of atomic weapons. And so my question is, how should the principles of our first director guide us today in terms of arms control, his views of arms control, or is it just that they're not relevant in our world today?
So let me jump in on this one, because I think sometimes you see in some depictions of the debate over thermonuclear weapons, which was at its core the issue that got Oppenheimer crosswise with the government, something between a misrepresentation and oversimplification of his views on the topic. It has been described as, this was because of moral objections to the destructive power of thermonuclear weapons, and driven by that kind of a motivation. I think that was part of his thinking. He did talk about, the destructive power. But I think the other thing to recognize is when this debate was happening at the end of the 40s, there was a tremendous pressure on the supply of nuclear material. In particular, at the time, Lawrence used to keep track of how many grams of neutrons the country was producing, because that told you, if you multiplied by 239, how many grams of plutonium you could make, how many grams of tritium you could make, because it was the neutrons in the production reactors that made that material. And there was a concern, given that shortage of supply, and this was before additional uranium reserves were discovered in the US later in the 50s, that we would be diverting material that was needed for, the fission weapons to another end, and that the security threat that was being faced at that time was basically Soviet tanks pouring through the Fulda Gap, and a thermonuclear weapon would not be useful for that. Because of its destructive power. It was too big. And what you needed was things like Davy Crockett's and what we now call tactical nuclear weapons. Actually, the things we're so concerned about the Russians using in the Ukraine because they have conventional force inferiority. At that time, overwhelming conventional force on the part of the Soviets. And so there was a strong feeling that thermonuclear weapons are not what we need for this threat. We're short of material. We need to make weapons that are actually useful for the threat that we face, because this was before the development of the concept of mutually assured destruction. There was no understanding of deterrence in the modern sense, where maybe the utility of something of that destructive power was in preventing conflict. And Oppenheimer was also articulating that view, which, oh, by the way, put him in the middle of a fight between the Army and the Air Force.
Right.
Because the Air Force wanted thermonuclear weapons that you could drop from airplanes, and the Army wanted tactical nukes that they could use to fight the Soviet Union.
And Oppie was supporting the Army guys.
And Oppie was supporting the Army. So it's also true that he also questioned whether or not you could use such a weapon, because so it wasn't that he was oblivious to the ethical concerns, but the issues he raised were much more complex than might be portrayed. So he was attentive to ethical concerns and certainly concerned about proliferation. He had a lot of discussions with Niels Bohr after the war as what ultimately led to the formation of the IAEA. It was being debated, what are the international controls? So he's very engaged on those issues, and I think that's important today. We at Los Alamos are very engaged on those issues. But I think he was also thinking about, what's the best use of our scarce resources given the threats that we face, which is also important today.
And also in the committee, I think that when, in the Los Alamos time, when Teller was pushing also for that bomb, Oppenheimer's role was, let's focus on what we have in hand. And later there was some development, technical development, that was making it more feasible. But so I think things changed as well. And there was this commission that was of scientists that was asked to assess about whether the government should go and work on the H-bomb. And their decision was no, and the government overruled what was the name of the
General Advisory Committee?
GAC.
Yeah.
So they asked the commission for an opinion, they gave the opinion, and the government at the time said, okay, thank you very much, we're going to do that.
Yeah. Well, and of course, the loyalty hearings were in '54, so the debate about the super was really at the end of the '40s. Right. And by the time you got to 1954, the political circumstances had changed considerably. And I think, there was, at that time, an ability to kind of maybe look back at decisions and arguments that had been made in the '40s with a different perspective. And, that was an overlay that caused people to question, well, why really was he advocating for this position? But I think there were a lot of reasons why he was advocating for that position. And it wasn't purely a kind of pacifist motivation.
Right. Right. This discussion reminds me of a story that I cannot resist telling. But in, I think, 1949, Oppie is called before the Senate and asked by a senator, well, Dr. Oppenheimer, what is the defense against a Russian ship smuggling a nuclear device aboard a ship into New York Harbor? And Oppie could be very flippant and yet pointed in his answer. And he quickly replied, well, a screwdriver.
A screwdriver.
You get a screwdriver and open up every suitcase and every crate being shipped into New York Harbor. The point is that he was trying to get people to think about the fact that there's no defense against a dirty bomb, a terrorist, a small actor. And we're still faced with, as I understand it, this issue. And I think his flippant response stimulated a highly classified report that is now, I'm told, is still known as the screwdriver report.
Well, this is, since at least 1944, the laboratory's been considering these issues, and Oppenheimer clearly raised the real difficulty involved in these. Let's have our last two questions, since I promised one back there, and then we'll come back up to the front. I appreciate the enthusiasm. Everybody sticking around to hear our panelists. So two more, quickly, please.
Thanks to the NSRC for organizing this. It's been really great. My question is for Kai Bird. I'm curious about the writing process, and how did you take 25 years worth of research and turn it into something that won a Pulitzer Prize and became the biography that Christopher Nolan based the film on? How did you even begin to wrap your head around all of those documents and interviews?
Well, it was a miracle. But a very quick answer is that Marty just had done fabulous research, and it was all, his transcripts of his interviews were all neatly typed by his former graduate students, and despite the chaos of his closets and his attic, he kept finding more boxes with more materials. It was very comprehensive and deep. And so when I started to write, he actually started to write. And I had, in my first biography, in my insecurity, I bent over backwards to write very detailed chapter outlines that took me longer to write the outline than the actual chapter. And so by the time I was writing Oppenheimer, I had given up on outlines. So we just wrote chronologically, and every night when I went to sleep, this is my trick. As I fall asleep, I try to think of the one anecdote that will get me going in the morning, that I can tell, that I can have some enthusiasm about writing, whether it be a small good quote or an anecdote. And that gets you started, and I wrote chronologically, and Marty knew the material so well that he could see where the holes were, and it turned into just a fabulous collaboration, which is a miracle because it's very rare for biographers to collaborate successfully. Our egos are too big usually for that kind of thing to survive.
Well, so graduate students, divine intervention, and Kai Bird. So there's the formula. Okay, our last question today, and then we'll close it out.
Thank you for your time today. Congratulations on the Pulitzer. I think that your biography is extremely vivid and rich, and I can see why, as a fellow screenwriter, why Christopher Nolan was very attracted to wanting to turn this into a visual spectacle. My question is also, as a writer, I think that our kind of goal in that self-affliction of writing is to have these moments where we find discoveries, right, in the process of research or creating character or creating worlds, where it changes us fundamentally as people and also as writers. And I'm curious what that moment was for you in this project, and also for the panel as readers, what that might have been for you. What did you take away the most from the work itself?
What single moment in the book?
Impossible.
Yeah, that's a tough question. Marty and I were very concerned that we wanted this story to be accessible. We wanted it not to be too dense. We wanted it to resonate. We wanted to convey the history and the man and his complexity. And so you may recall, we begin the book actually with an anecdote about the day that Oppenheimer learns that he's about to be, quote, indicted by Louis Strauss and his efforts to bring him down in the security hearing. And he goes to a meeting with his lawyer, which is wiretapped.
Bugged everywhere.
And then he adjourns to the home of his close friend, actually, Ann Wilson, the secretary I mentioned. And they're having a drink, and he goes to the bathroom, and it's a very dramatic story. He suddenly collapsed. Everybody hears an enormous crash, and he's in the bathroom and apparently collapsed on the floor. And Kitty and Ann Wilson try to wedge open the door and finally get him out. And he apparently had taken a sleeping pill and had a drink, and and he was overwhelmed, I think, with anxiety. Again, it captured sort of the fragile nature of this personality. And we wanted to humanize him. We wanted to tell our readers, yes, he's this iconic historical figure, the father of the atomic bomb, but he's a human being who is vulnerable. And that story, explained it and drew the reader in. And we tried to do that with some kind of anecdote in that way at the beginning and the end of each chapter.
So I think in reading the book, there were two things that really sort of struck me just in terms of the overall impression. I've read there's a lot written about the history of the Manhattan Project. And I'm pretty sure I've read all of it. Richard Rhodes, there's the Brotherhood of the Bomb, there's the National Labs book, there's 109 East Palace. So the Manhattan Project story I felt like I knew pretty well. When you read American Prometheus, what you see is that's a tiny sliver of a really fascinating life that extends both before and after that I was much less aware of. So that was one thing is, boy, the Manhattan Project was only 2.5 years out of
27 months.
Out of a really amazing, rich, varied life. And the other thing that really struck me is, as rich and varied as Robert Oppenheimer's life was, Kitty was even more interesting.
Right. She was. Yeah.
Well, on that note, will you join me in thanking our panelists again?